Okay, welcome everyone to this session. So the Arts Symposium, as we've called it, with Stephen Batchelor and Iain McGilchrist. So the focus of this session really is the arts as practice. By practice here, when you practice in a broad sense, that would include appreciation of the arts as well as creation using the arts. Yeah, the format of this session will be that each of our two panelists, Stephen and Iain, will speak for around 10 minutes or so on the theme of what the arts has meant to them personally and what they get from the arts as practice, which, as I say, includes appreciation. I then may put a question or two of my own to them, and then we'll open it to everybody else. So obviously, while we're going along, if any questions occur to you, then do feel free to put them in the chat box. Also, I'll be looking really to get some of your voices, some of your experiences as well. So particularly if you're inspired by what Iain and Stephen say about their practice of the arts, if you'd like to speak from your own experience, you'll obviously have to be brief, but if you want to say something about how you yourself have benefited from the practice of the arts and found, really looking at how the arts can have an integrative effect, how they can help us in our lives in the long term and help us make better judgments and so on. So I'm hoping we'll get a bit of experiences from the audience as well as some questions and maybe discussion about the role of the arts. Okay, so just to briefly introduce our two panelists. So they're both better known for their work on other subjects. So Stephen for his books about Buddhism, particularly secular Buddhism, and Iain for his work on brain lateralization, particularly The Master and His Emissary. But in both cases, certainly I feel reading their books that their engagement in the arts and the intensity of their engagement with the arts has made a big difference to their outlook and added to the insights of their work in one way or another. Very often I feel that, people who have some kind of engagement with the middle way, which may be quite intuitive, but quite often they have a breadth of outlook in some sense, that they're engaged in different disciplines and different traditions. And that's certainly the case for both of our speakers today. So if I could bring in, first of all, then Stephen Batchelor, Stephen, if you'd like to talk a bit about your own experience of the arts as practice.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your kind introduction, Robert. And it's a great honor, actually, to be on this panel with you, and particularly with Iain, whom I've never met before, and I'm only virtually meeting now. I'd like to talk about my own practice as an artist, and I'd like to start by saying that although I'm well known as a writer of books on Buddhism, I feel in some ways I'm an artist manqué. That I think my deeper longing, as from the time of being a fairly young child, was to live a life dedicated to some kind of creative process, to the arts in particular. My great uncle was a fairly well-known sculptor. My mother encouraged me in the arts. And I remember particularly when I would have been about 12 years old, we were asked to design a cover for the folder in which we kept our homework and stuff. And what I did was just took a few bits of random cuttings from magazines and whatever, and put it all together as a collage and used that as the cover for my homework file. And I can remember even right now, the feeling it gave me, that I was organizing things that had been, which were not intrinsically connected. And yet, by putting them together, I created something else. And that gave me such a powerful, I don't know really, a sort of wave of enthusiasm, inspiration. I can't even find the right words for it, but I feel that all of my work since then has been very much tied to reconnecting to that sense of, I would almost say, joy, actually, and it's kind of the excitement of composition, of putting things together. And I've been driven by that. I continue to be driven by that each time that I set myself a task of writing an essay or whatever. And for many years, while I was a Buddhist monk, the arts were very much frowned upon. You were not encouraged to do any kind of artistic activity. It was actually considered to be a distraction. And so for many years, I put aside this particular part of my life. But when I returned after 10 years or so in Asia to live in a lay Buddhist community in Devon, I remember very vividly coming back on the train from Paddington to Totnes, and I found myself sitting at one of those tables you have in those trains. And just for some reason, I took all the stuff out of my pockets, out of my bags, just to sort of tidy stuff up, and I laid it down on the table in front of me. And suddenly I got that same childhood recollection that, I could put all this rubbish, which is basically, it was rubbish, tickets to cinemas, little flyers from art galleries, bits of the latest paper. And I thought, this is the material for a piece of art. And from that moment on, and I know exactly when that was July 25th, 1995. Ever since then, I have been and am still working on collage. Now, the collages I do have followed exactly the same principles from July 1995. I only work with found materials. In other words, things that are being discarded and rejected and considered to be of no value or use. I collect this stuff. I pay attention very closely to my environment to notice the things that people have rejected. And if they are gluable, in other words, paper, cloth, plastic, then I collect them, I gather them, I store them, and they become my palette, as it were, for my art. I never buy my materials. Sometimes at a car boot sale, I might buy some old photographs or whatever, but generally I don't. I work with the found materials that are all around me. And I then organize them into grids or mosaics, you might say. I'm going to show you some examples, because this is one of the advantages of being local, being virtual, is that I've got all my art materials with me here. So I take these randomly found materials and then I organize them in highly formal mosaic structures. Now, probably these mosaic structures could be defined by some sort of algorithms, but I do not have a mathematical cell in my brain. And so what happens is that I see these mathematical structures. I see these grid orientations and structures. And it's quite strange. As the process continues, I find myself occasionally struck by an image of where the process goes next. I don't think about it at all. I worry sometimes of running out of ideas, but now I've abandoned that because I have complete trust in this very unconscious process that's working. And the form of the images appears to me. It's weird, but that's what it is. It's a sort of and yet they're not visual like visualizations, but I know exactly what they mean. And what I've found in practice is that this process of creating collage along, on the one hand, foundness, on the other hand, highly formal structures, which is a tension. It's between order and chaos, if you wish, or between sameness and difference, that these accompany my process of working as a writer. So every book that I've worked on since 1995, and that would thereby start with Buddhism Without Beliefs, which in a sense is the book for which I'm best known. And in some ways, that book then started the process of all the ones I've written since. And so accompanying every piece of written work, there is also a counterpoint in visual work, in artwork, in collage work, but they don't in any sense, overtly correspond one to the other. They're two quite separate processes. And yet, and I cannot explain to myself or to others how they're actually connected, but I know intuitively and bodily that they are profoundly interconnected. Another dimension of the collage work as a counterpoint to the written work is that it means that I engage my body. One of the things that I enjoy about artwork is that I don't have to think, I don't have to organize words and ideas and sentences and paragraphs, all of that goes. Yet I come into a relationship with the materials of the physical world through my hands primarily, through my body, through my eyes. This occurs both in the finding of the materials and the putting them together, using scalpels, using glues, using pieces of card, framing. All of this is a highly physical engagement, an embodied engagement with these materials. And this to me is therefore part and parcel of my work as a writer. As we'll see in a couple of minutes if I have time, I mean, this is now developing in a way where the two are actually becoming fused. At a certain point in this process, I began concentrating very much on primary colors, but primary colors as the Buddhist tradition understands primary colors. In Buddhism, there are 4 primary colors: red, blue, yellow, white. Now in the West, we think of white not as a color or as all colors. But in Buddhism, and this goes right back to the earliest Pali texts, and it's still the norm in the Tibetan studies I did much later, you always have these 4 colors. And they have become, over the last 10 or so years, the primary focus of my work. In other words, working with these 4 colors. And these 4 colors I now associate with what I spoke about yesterday, the 4 tasks. Yellow corresponds to me for the earth, and this is the practice of the first task of embracing life. Red stands for fire, and this is the second task of letting go of the fires of reactivity. White stands for air or space, and this is the third task of beholding the emptiness or the stopping of reactivity. And blue corresponds to water, which is the fourth task of cultivating the path. And the path, remember, the Eightfold Path, is compared to a stream, a flow of water. So there is, in my mind at least, a very clear-cut correspondence now between the primary work as a Buddhist thinker and the visual work I do as an artist. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. This is this piece here, for example, is composed. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. This is a piece, it's about 48 centimeters square. It's of 4 colors, as you can see, and it's found exclusively of found materials, organized in a grid-like pattern. So that's one side of it. But then I've started in this series to break away from just using colors and also to incorporate images. And so this is exactly the same format, exactly the same number of pieces, arranged in exactly the same way, but these are actually old photographs that I picked up at car boot sales in the countryside around me. And so I then have a dyad, the two together, you see, and I did 8 of these. These take me, each one takes me about a year to make. It's a very slow, very contemplative process. And I realize I'm running out of time, so I'll just quickly run ahead to my current work. The book that I've just published, called The Art of Solitude, this is a copy of it, is actually designed as a collage. What I did when starting to think of this book was to conceive of my written work along the same formal principles I use in my visual work. That's the first time I've done that. And once again, the imagery, the forms were very much, came to me in a sense, sort of intuitively, spontaneously. And they were influenced by a set of 4 poems in Pali from the Atthakavagga, which I call the 4 eights. They're chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the Atthakavagga. And they're each 8 verses, each with 4 lines, making a total of 32. And to me, 32 becomes a very central framework. And the way in which I designed the book was very much designed according to the 4 eights, the making of 32. The book, if you read it, you'll notice has 32 chapters. Each of us, and the writing, the book itself has 32,000 words as well. I don't have time to go into any greater detail than that, except to say that this is what the book looks like. This is the collage. This is fairly small. This is 16 centimeters square. But you see, each chapter is color-coded. There are 4 themes in the book: philosophy, contemplation, medicine, and solitude and art, or the solitude of art. And they're each color-coded, which was chosen by chance operations as to which chapter got which color code. And then they're mixed up randomly again. And then the book is then, this order of the chapters follows the sequence of these color-coded things. So in this way, the book is actually, it's a literary collage. And interestingly, it's also not a Buddhist book anymore. Both this book and the book that will follow, I'm not trying to persuade anybody of any Buddhist ideas I may have. I'm trying to show these themes now rather than explain them or justify them or rationalize them. And as I showed you before, I was working with dyads, and the art of solitude is actually just 1/2 of a dyad. The counter work, which I'm beginning to work on now, will be called the art of care. And the art of care will be exactly in the same organization, 32 chapters, also based on a very early Buddhist list. And that will look, and I've already done, and here, this time I've done it the other way around. I've already designed this is what the book will look like, or this is what the book looks like, but it hasn't been written yet. That's going to be the difficult bit. But that's what I'm engaged on now, is actually now writing this book, and it'll probably take 4 or 5 years, but it will follow intuitively the organization of those patterns, those collage structures that I've put together. So that's, in brief, one example of how I use my art as an integral part of my writing process, my work, and perhaps more importantly, as an integral part of my practice as a human being. That's what really matters. And I find these 2 elements create a synthesis, a wholeness in my practice that I think if I were just a writer or just a visual artist, I wouldn't achieve.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Stephen. So if we can go on to Iain now, and obviously if people have questions about what you've said, we can come back to that later. Iain?
Okay, thank you very much. I feel I've got nothing to offer in the way that Stephen had. I'm not an artist and I have no pictures for you. The closest I get is that I used to write poetry, and I want to start again, but I'm hoping to make time in my life for that. But the arts in general have been of absolutely primary importance to me. There have been a number of epiphanies, if you like, in my life, and one of the ones associated with music was when I first heard Tallis's Lamentations. I couldn't believe the power and the beauty of what I was hearing, and it seemed to me to be impossible to encapsulate it in terms of purely emotion or structure, although both of these things come into it. But it seemed to me profoundly to speak of the spiritual and the ensouled, and it's still impossible for me to talk about Tallis and his contemporaries, whose music I, in my early teens, set about getting to know as fast as I possibly could, without using terms such as soul. And then I remember another epiphany was when somebody was invited to a small room, a friend, to play, this was when I was at school, to play Beethoven's, I think it's A-flat Major Sonata Opus 110, one of his late piano sonatas. And this again was absolutely staggering for me. It told me something about the way the world is that I'd intuited mainly from nature up till that point, but that simply made me shake my head when I was confronted with what I was supposed to believe about this stuff in a purely scientific world picture. And then at about the same time, so 15 or 16, I started really exploring poetry. I devoured poetry, and quite a lot of it was spiritual. George Herbert and Donne and their contemporaries, but also people like John Clare, who is not a religious writer, but is somehow very much speaking about the divine in nature, and poets like Hopkins and so forth. So these things were extraordinarily vivid to me and extraordinarily nourishing to me. And as I say, helped me see that there was far more to the world than what I was, at least in the sort of mainstream theory of the age, was being taught to believe. C.S. Lewis says somewhere something like, all the things that I really valued, I was taught were worthless, and all the things that I thought of as dull and lifeless were said to be the things that matter. So I found myself in that situation. I naturally gravitated in a way to spiritual traditions, to reading the medieval mystics, Richard of St. Victor, and Van Rysbroek, and of course Meister Eckhart and so forth. So all that seemed to me seamlessly in touch with the great poets and the great composers that I learnt to love, particularly Mozart, Bach, but the Renaissance composers and as I say, late Beethoven and his amazing last quartet. So I could never again see the world in non-spiritual terms. To me, that was absolutely clear evidence that there was more here than was possibly encapsulated in language or in theory or in anything else. And I then ended up slightly by accident studying English literature at Oxford. I had intended to do theology and philosophy, but it wasn't an honors degree in those days. And they said, oh, you can't do a non-honors degree. You ought to do literature. So I did, which I completely loved. And I had a very wonderful tutor, John Bailey, who's become better known as the husband of Iris Murdoch, but is a very fine writer about literature in his own right. And his ironic, subtle, tutelary spirit opened up windows to the colossal richness of particularly poetry. I mean, I've enjoyed, of course, many other writers, novelists, essayists, and so on, but to me, the most precious thing of all, apart from certain pieces of music, is poetry. And then there was another epiphany when I was doing, I think I was doing, yes, my finals. And I'd chosen Wordsworth and Coleridge as a special subject at Oxford. There was one of the 8 papers in finals. You had to choose you had no, as it were, ultimate choice, but you had 8 alternatives. And one of them was Wordsworth and Coleridge. And I thought, well, I know I like Coleridge, and he's fascinating. And indeed he is. And I've always found Coleridge's writing, which was largely inspired by Schelling, another philosopher I greatly admire, very interesting. But I thought, I can't get it about this Wordsworth, you know, I mean, good Lord, he's so boring and pompous and so on. But I thought, I'll get reward from Coleridge, but maybe I'll get my eyes open to what it is about Wordsworth. Some people whose opinion I respect think he's rather important. And one day I went for a very long tutorial with Rachel Trickett, who was the principal of St. Hugh's. It was supposed to be about Goldsmith, and it went on for a couple of hours. And we got into talking about all kinds of verse, including Wordsworth. And she said, Iain, let me read to you the first 100 lines or so of Tintern Abbey, Wordsworth's poem, the Ode on Tintern Abbey. And I almost said to her, look, it's getting towards supper time. I know this very well. In fact, a lot of it I know by heart. You really don't need to read it to me. But fortunately, I didn't. And she read it. And I thought, I have never heard this poem before. I'd actually read it many times. It was absolutely a revelation. And I remember walking home to dinner in college down the Woodstock Road, and everything seemed suffused with light, and as though my feet hardly touched the ground. I mean, that's just how it was. And it's these moments of profound insight coming through music and poetry, mainly for me, but also painting, and certain places, certain pieces of architecture. Above all, the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence, and Vierzehnheiligen in Bavaria, two places that I remember visiting and trying 3 or 4 times to exit from, but had to, in each case, keep going back inside the church. But this is the foundation of a sense of what the cosmos is capable of, what human beings are capable of, and what the meaning of life is. It's not anything that can be put into any other terms than these, coupled with the love of nature and of people. A lot of the feelings here that were religious feelings, I later found were quite similar to those on the 1 or 2 occasions I've experienced really very strongly being in love with somebody. So I think they're very, very deep things, very important things. And when I got to Oxford and started studying literature, I was a little bit shocked that these great gifts, really, from people who had died but thought they were leaving us something precious, were talked about intelligently. But these things that depended on being implicit and embodied and entirely unique, we turned them into things that were generalized, abstract, and disembodied. And I just thought something wrong with this process. So I wrote a book called Against Criticism, trying to explain what I was only later to account for after I discovered the extraordinary difference between the 2 brain hemispheres, the one that can do the speaking and the one that does the understanding. And that was the topic of The Master and His Emissary. So in conclusion, I think it's very, very important that we don't fall prey to the idea that somehow education is about technical instruction. It isn't. It's about opening people's eyes to the fire that is in great works of art and that transforms lives. And nothing is wrong, more wrong than the idea that, as it were, the serious business is what goes on in your day job, making money for Goldman Sachs. And then you have some sort of light relief in the evening when you go to a concert. The point of living is the concert. The other thing is a total distraction.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Iain. It's very interesting, which I can relate to in all sorts of ways. So, that we've got several people with questions who I'll come to very shortly. I've got one question of my own, which I'd like to put to both of you, and just see what you respond. I mean, if you don't want to answer it, that's fine. It's entirely up to you. So my question is, what do you think beauty is?
Sorry?
What do I think
beauty is? What is beauty?
Beauty.
Juicy?
Beauty.
Beauty.
With a B.
B-E-A-U-T-Y.
I can't even hear this word. Can you spell it?
B-E-A-U-T-Y. Beauty.
Oh, beauty. Yes, sorry, I got it. I thought you were saying Lucy, then juicy, and so on. Never mind. Yes, okay, good.
Okay, I'll start. In a somewhat Socratic, aporeic way, I don't know. And yet, when I encounter beauty, I somehow feel I immediately engage with what seems to fit that word. But in many ways, in my appreciation of art, I find that I'm not really looking so much for beauty, although I, of course, greatly admire many of the works that Iain spoke of. The late Beethoven piano sonatas and string quartets have always been an incredible inspiration to me, and these are extreme examples of what I would consider to be beautiful. But in many ways, I've come more to think of art as a way of helping me to see the world differently. In other words, to me, a work of art, in a sense, has an impact if it actually challenges me to look at myself and to look at the world from another point of view. And I think a lot of contemporary art, particularly, has this capacity. I was in Heidelberg recently, and I went to the Contemporary Art Museum in Mannheim. And there was one work of Anselm Kiefer, the contemporary German artist, who works on a massive scale. And again, whether I would call that beautiful, I don't know, to be honest, but it profoundly affected and shocked me in a way that opened my eyes to see myself and the world otherwise. Exactly how, I cannot say. But that is often, to me, more helpful, I suppose, in my engagement with art than whether or not it corresponds to some idea of the beautiful.
Okay, Iain, do you want to?
Well, thank you. Of course, I also can't say what beauty is, but that is a very benign thing, because what it suggests is it is entirely irreducible to any other phenomena. As Stephen says, one knows when one's in the presence of it. There's a lot to say about it, really, and I'm trying to think how I can do it briefly. I think it is an irreducible facet of the cosmos. In fact, the word cosmos means something that is beautiful and orderly. We can't really explain why there is anything rather than nothing, but we also can't explain why the something that is should be so beautiful, so complex, and so orderly. It's certainly not the same as truth or goodness. It can ally itself with things that are neither of these, which means that we have to preserve these ideas as separate ideas. But what it certainly cannot be is what a lot of people of the Dawkins persuasion would say it is, an inherited strategy for finding beautiful partners that are fit and fertile. And there's a whole load of reasons why that can't possibly be right. Starting with the fact that, in fact, a lot of people who are attractive sexually are not beautiful, and beautiful are not attractive sexually. But also, far more importantly, that it doesn't explain anything about beauty. It just explains that beauty existing, given beauty, can evolution latch onto it and use it. And of course it can and does, but it isn't the origin of it. Nor is it possible to account for the beauty of sterile landscapes, the very opposite of fertile, productive ones, of deserts, ice landscapes, and mountainous wastes, which we might think of, well, that's all very well, that's a post-romantic view. But actually in the 5th century AD, Christian hermits were talking about the extraordinary beauty of the desert. And for hundreds of years before the year dot and after it, Chinese writers were celebrating, both in their poetry and in their landscapes, enormously wild and inhospitable places. Nor does it explain why e to the I pi equals -1 is entirely beautiful, nor the beauty of a Bach fugue. So there's beauty that we recognize through things that are structured into our bodies in some ways. So it is not, as some people have suggested, nonsense that the golden ratio is found to be beautiful. It has been found to be beautiful in virtually all cultures where they had no understanding of it mathematically. But it is very strongly based on, or not necessarily based on, but reflective of, let me put it that way, the structure of the human frame as a body. So beauty is unfathomable. It is it's to be found in things that are thoroughly physical and things that are thoroughly spiritual. And I consider it to be one of the, as it were, ontological primitives of the cosmos. I think values are not things that we paint on according to our whim, but are intrinsic. And of course, the things that we decide to call beautiful are influenced by the culture to which we belong. But in a side note on that, there is extraordinary agreement across cultures and across times about what is to be considered beautiful. So, for example, pieces of Japanese art and so on are found beautiful by people who don't belong to the tradition, and great works of Western art are found beautiful to the Japanese or the Mongolians or whoever it might be. Even to the point that the same meaning is attributed to expressions in Indian music by Norwegian subjects who know nothing whatever about Indian music. So there are universals there, but of course they're not entirely universal. As is always the case, the universal and the particular have to be in balance with one another.
Okay, thank you very much for those. Tempted to add more, but I won't. I will move on to the other people who are queuing up to ask further questions. So, yeah, Judith Vaughan, first of all, would you like to unmute yourself? You've got some things you'd like to share?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it's not really a question. It's just sharing an experience of something that I created, which was a story at a family gathering a couple of years ago. There was two of my uncles were celebrating their 70th and 80th birthdays, and there was a request for the family of all generations to create something, you know, pictures, dances, and so on. And I chose to tell a story in the form of a journey fable. But it was actually a story about our family that was contained an awful lot of wounding and trauma and shame and taboo, which of course are not really the subjects you want to bring to a sort of light-hearted family gathering. But I found a way, it felt sort of like a calling really. I found a way to tell the story that made it an enjoyable story for everyone to hear, regardless of them knowing really what the background was, or many of them did, but there were small children there too. And there was something about the process, and it made me think of what Iain talked about in the last session. I think he talked about the term presencing, and it felt like that. It felt like something was conjured into being in a form that made it universal and implicit, and it wasn't just the writing of the story, it was the making of it, but more particularly the telling of it. When the party came about, I just sat in a circle and told it like a sort of a story around a campfire, and it was the voice. It was something about, in that moment, the telling of the story, and I think it was understood by different members of my family, from the small children to those in their 80s, at different levels, and just something really quite remarkable happened. I mean, the whole thing was a very frightening thing for me to do. It felt very risky, but it felt beautiful in the telling, and in the moment and later when people sort of reflected back, there was something very healing about it. You know, across the generations, it felt genuinely like a gift, like something that just had been brought into being. And it felt more like finding a form of something that was already there. It felt more like creating a sculpture rather than putting words on a blank page, the whole process of it. And I just wanted to share that really. It was an incredibly liberating and expansive experience, and it felt like something that had been solid and calcified in our family for a long, long time, loosened and softened and flowed. And yeah, I just wanted to share that that's what I did.
Okay, thank you. Would either of you like to respond to that, or?
I think it stood very much by itself, and I think it brings out also, to me, another important dimension of art, and that is it can be a healing. It can somehow, by getting us out of our rational minds, as it were, by integrating other dimensions of what we feel and sense and our relationships with others, and bringing that all together in the form, in this case, of a story, a narrative. It's certainly not just about the beauty of it, but it's also about how it somehow heals, it cures, it somehow saves us in a way.
I thought what you said was beautiful and moving, and I really wouldn't want to say too much, but I did very much appreciate your remark that it felt like something that had been there. I think this process of creation is the contact with something that is sort of there but not known, and it's a reverberative process of communicating with it, in which it comes more and more into being. It doesn't come out of nowhere, but it wasn't fully formed until you contacted it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Judith.
Thank you.
Perhaps could we have Hannah next? You'd like to talk about an experience, Hannah? Want to unmute yourself?
Hi, thanks everybody. Yeah, I just wanted to speak briefly about a experience that brings out maybe a slightly different aspect for me, which is the artist as potentially as a spiritual guru, which is something that you know, I hadn't really been aware of, and so basically, I'll tell the story of what happened. So I was going through, it was a few years ago, I was going through a particular phase where I had a particular question, existential dilemma that I was going through, and that was basically encapsulated by the phrase, how can life be so absolutely and utterly beautiful and so absolutely and utterly horrific at the same time? And I could not integrate that. I could not seem to understand that and be able to integrate that. It was causing me a lot of distress. And that was around the time I was also working as a doctor and seeing a lot of suffering in that, and becoming interested in psychiatry, and also going through my own psychological processes. And I went to see a Grayson Perry exhibition. If anyone knows Grayson Perry, he's an artist who is an interesting artist in the way that he almost has used his work as art therapy. So he went through a process of just making a living out of his own art therapy, which is quite unusual, I think. But I went to see his exhibition. It was very strange. It was one of those experiences where I got up one Saturday morning, had not planned this at all, got on a train by myself, went to London, and sort of ended up at this exhibition. And coming into this exhibition, the pots that he produces spoke directly to the question that the existential question that I was dealing with. So I'll just show you the pot, which is the one that really, thanks, if you can see it. So the thing with his pots, the way you experience them is as you go into the exhibition, you're further away from them and they look like a beautiful pot. So as you walk into the room, there's just a room full of beautiful pots and beautiful ceramics. And then as you come closer to the pot itself, you realise what's actually happening as well. So this pot is called "We Found the Body of Your Child," and it's the thing that happens is that you're then met with the distinction between the beautiful and the horrific. As you can see, the image there in the body of the child. There's also some words up there which are the parents' abuse of the child before the child passed away. So and his work is all to do with this. So basically I saw this, I was literally in the room for like 10-15 minutes. I saw this work and it sort of something clicked. So I had something clicked in my brain. I literally came out of it. I sat down outside in the street and I sobbed openly in the street for 20 minutes, and then something that resolved itself. And it was a very similar experience to spiritual experiences that I've had during meditation. at various points in my life. And I just I just wanted to share that experience with you, because I've been to further exhibitions with him and obviously been involved with his work, and it is a very similar experience for me of being involved with and in a personal relationship with a spiritual teacher. It's, you know, it's his work seems to speak to me on that level, on certain levels, and I'll do the thing about contacting him and trying to express that to him at some point, but I'm not quite sure how I would do that. So, but that's my story. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Would either of you like to respond to that?
Well, I think once again it shows the healing quality of being with art. How that works, I don't have a clue, but it's very moving to hear these stories. And also I can think of times in my own life too, where it's often been through a work of art, which may have no explicit connection with some struggle I'm going through within myself, but nonetheless serves as a kind of catalyst to trigger a kind of a resolution, which is non-conceptual usually, and it usually affects you, you know, emotionally and physically as well. So I felt that was very moving again, and I think it shows that dimension of art very well.
I'd agree wholly with that, and it caused me to reflect on the respect I have for art therapy. You know, Stephen's talking about the healing powers of art, which I think is absolutely right, is one of its characteristics for all of us throughout life. But I've been astonished by the power of art therapy for people sometimes who are difficult to help through more explicit verbal therapies. I would ask them to go and do sessions in art therapy, and they say, oh, I'm never any good at that. And the trouble was they were hyper-verbal, you know, they were brilliantly good at explaining themselves in words, but it was very good for them to be lost in a way, in a realm in which they hadn't got that, and they were able to contact something which for them was very powerful. And it sounds something like that you're describing, a very healing moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Okay, well, we have a question from Vijaya, if you'd like to unmute yourself, Vijaya.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My question was probably for both, but probably more for Iain. I was wondering about the word prosody. After I was taken as a birthday gift to a Shakespeare performance recently, I was left wondering how the writing communicated so much when you couldn't really follow all the words. It was acted at quite a pace. And so I was looking up this word prosody as I might have got this wrong, but as a description of all the things that aren't strictly in the text, but the way, the nuance, the rhythm, the way the text is voiced, which might relate to Judith's story of the telling of a story and Ian's mentioning of the Wordsworth poem. But I'm wondering how, if I've got that term right, and how the term prosody might be some clue to linking text on a page to performance and, well, I suppose motion and everything else.
Well, thank you very much. It's a big, big question. In terms of neuropsychology, prosody tends to be the music of speech, basically, the part that's left when you've taken the actual words meanings out and are left with a musical structure. And in The Master and His Emissary, I espouse a theory which is not mine. I'm not an anthropologist, but is quite widely held by anthropologists, that language evolved out of music. Steven Pinker says somewhere that music is useless and pointless and is about as much use as pornography or cheesecake. It's a sort of side effect of language. I take the exact opposite view, that music is how we originally communicated, as indeed most animals can communicate through musical sounds, and they're highly, highly expressive. And as you say, embodied. I was very struck by the fact that in places in Africa where people need to communicate over considerable distances, it can be done by beating a drum, which gets around the fact that, you know, if you move 10 miles, people probably have a completely different language anyway, but also means that a message can be understood through the beating of a drum. And in order to understand it, you have to see the bodily movements of the person who is actually beating that rhythm. You have to be in your mind that person out of whom the rhythm is coming. And that explains to the receiver what it is that is being said. So I believe very powerfully that prosody is very important. And of course, we know that from the way in which we communicate with children, particularly mothers, instinctively adopt what's called motherese, which is a kind of very large pitch excursions as they talk to the baby. And it's not, of course, the words, it's all in those inflections and in the facial expressions and the body language. So most of what we communicate is in that implicit realm of which prosody is part. And prosody is very strongly right hemisphere based. So that when people have right hemisphere damage, not only can they not pick up the nuances of what's being said, but their speech tends to become monotonous all along a line like that. Increasingly, I tend to hear people on the radio talking like that as they get deeper and deeper into this left hemisphere culture that we're all in, you know? But I prefer some prosody.
Thank you. Don't know if Stephen would like to add to that.
Well, the only thing I would add is that as you were talking, I was reflecting on what in a project I've been working on for some years now, which is an opera. I've written the libretto to a chamber opera called Mara, which is the Buddhist equivalent of Satan, if you wish. And it's a 2-act opera. And again, I'm not a musician. I don't know how to compose or anything like that. I love music, but I don't understand it at all. But my task was to write the libretto. So I had to write, and I drew all the material from the Pali Canon, which is very dull, rather repetitive language. So I had to find a way of rendering these classical texts in a form that could actually be sung. And that meant versifying them and often stripping it down to what seems to be the core emotional message that is communicated through these texts, rather than just an account of some situation that's being described. And this opera now has only been once or twice performed for small audiences, but what's really amazed me is how the words in an opera, as you know, you often can't even hear the words. That's kind of irrelevant, but it's the rhythms, it's the intonations, it's all of that, and also the movement of the characters, the actors, the singers, the different voices, soprano, baritone, bass, which we have in this opera. How all of that contributes to the meaning, even though the words you don't really understand. And the first performance we did of this, because the composer lives in South Carolina, is we performed it to a small audience in Florence, South Carolina, composed entirely of Southern Baptists and no Buddhists amongst them. The Buddhists would have come because it's a Buddhist story, but we performed it to an audience which was essentially Christian, evangelical Christian, and they were able to respond to it in the way, exactly the way we had hoped. They were moved, they saw this story as profoundly archetypal, not some Buddhist narrative to promote Buddhism. And that, to all of us, the composer and myself, was the sign that we were onto something that transcended the specific Buddhist content of the opera itself.
Yes, wonderful answers, thank you.
Great. Okay, I think we have a question from James, which I think is probably specifically for Iain. It's about the brain. James, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if...
So you're a bit faint, James. Can you get any louder?
Is that any better? No.
Can you hear him, Iain and Stephen?
Yeah, I can hear.
I can just about hear it. It's not very loud, but...
I'll just stick a microphone in. Hang on a minute. Maybe is that any better?
That's a lot better.
Yes, lots.
Okay. I wanted to ask, I sort of had a thought that I used to go and look at abstract art in art galleries, and I would sort of generally dislike it because I couldn't make sense of it. And I think that was my kind of left brain sort of not liking it. And then one day I just saw a piece by John Hoyland, and I just thought, wow, that's just, I love that. That's so beautiful. And I thought, well, why do I like some abstract art and why do I not like others? You know, and I was quite curious about that. And I suppose my question is, does art have a way of shutting out the sort of left brain in a way and enabling the right hemisphere to be sort of opened up?
Well, not in a simple way, because we know that when people appreciate a work of art, a visual work of art, that is to say, they're certainly using both hemispheres to do so. Mm-hmm. In terms of beauty appreciation, which is something that was touched on earlier, it seems much more dependent on the right hemisphere, but both hemispheres are working there. I don't know what to say really about abstract art, some of which, of course, as you say, is very beautiful. But in the Master's Emissary, I suggested that art couldn't possibly be an exception to the way in which the culture of the 20th century had moved. Art can never be an exception to the culture. It is an expression of the culture. Mm-hmm. And it may produce great works in defiance of a not very propitious cultural timbre, but it's still going to show the marks of that. And mm-hmm. It just struck me as interesting that a number of the ways of expressing oneself visually, which are open to people who have had right hemisphere damage, you know, have been prioritized in the 20th century. But that's not to disrespect forms of art. It's all far too complicated and subtle for that. So I don't know, and I can't possibly answer the question why you like some and not others.
Well, exactly.
You won't be able to answer that. As they say, de gustibus non est disputandum. So, you know, there we are. Yeah.
Well, I suppose in a way, thank you. I suppose in a way, because it's not possible to analyse why some abstract art appeals to me and some doesn't, I'm assuming that the kind of analytical bit of the hemisphere is not involved in that process of appreciation in some way.
I think it's more complicated than that, but I think I understand the drift of your point, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
I wonder if I could follow that up slightly, Ian, with just ask if you could connect that question about the two hemispheres to what happens with music, because I understand there were some differences in the way that people process music in the hemispheres depending on well, their degree of experience with music, for example, or whether they're professionals.
Yes, for most of us, the appreciation of melody and harmony is very strongly based on the right hemisphere. And for most of us, simple rhythm is more appreciated in the left hemisphere, although syncopated rhythms and complicated cross rhythms require the function of the right hemisphere again. So for most of us, most of the important matter in music is very much right hemisphere appreciated, and it often draws on the same areas. When I say same, I mean the homologous regions in the right hemisphere to those that subserve language in the left, which makes sense of the idea that, as it were, language emerged out of music, because in fact in children, they're very much right hemisphere dependent on language to begin with, and this migrates over to the left hemisphere in about the second or third year of life. However, there's a difference in professional musicians, which may be what you're referring to. But in professional musicians, they seem to use the two hemispheres more evenly and even privilege the left hemisphere. And it's very difficult to know quite why, but there are a number of reasons why this might be the case. One obvious one is that they may be thinking more analytically about the structure of the piece of music rather than purely surrendering themselves to, as it were, the presence of the music. Another may be that they have been taught to use both hands together in the production of music. Most musicians at least play a keyboard, and most musical instruments require both hands to be coordinated. And it may be that this causes more bilateral representation of music. A third possibility is that musicians learn to read music left to right in very much the way that we read words, and thus engage that part of the mind, even if they're not actually currently reading it at the time. One theory I have, and therefore like, is that one difference between the right hemisphere and the left is the right hemisphere processes things as they are new and as they're not wholly encompassed, whereas the left hemisphere responds to things that by now have become very familiar. Now, if you're a professional musician, you have had to play this piece of music hundreds of times before you're willing to perform. And so it is really a very, very familiar piece to you. And something that puts the icing on the cake for this, for me, is a very nice piece of research which shows that Bach is an exception to this. So that when people, even professional musicians, perform Bach, it is much more right hemisphere dependent. And for me, that is an expression of the fact that you can never wholly encompass what Bach is giving you. You can't, because of so much going on at once, you can only focus with your left hemisphere on one bit at a time. And so you're compelled to be using your global right hemisphere. I may be wrong, but I like it anyway.
Okay, well, we're about running out of time, I'm afraid. There have been several other questions which I'm afraid we haven't got time to address, but thank you to the people who asked those. And there will, well, I mean, there will be the opportunity for further discussion on the forum on the Modern Way Society website if you want to carry on discussing these things. Obviously, I can't promise that Iain and Stephen will want to join in with that, but there can be more general discussion there to follow on.
Robert, can I possibly just say one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, I just want to alert everybody to the launch of something called Channel McGilchrist at www.channelmcgilchrist.com. Please go and sign up on it. It doesn't cost you anything to do so, and it gives you up-to-date information about what I'm doing. Eventually, it will contain material which cannot be found elsewhere on the internet, and it will contain a chat room in which people who are interested in discussing things that arise out of my work can do so. And we hope in time to have an occasion whereby people can put in questions, and once a month I will answer some of those questions. So it's a place where you can interface with me if you want to use that awful modern language. Anyway, Channel McGilchrist, there we go. You can channel me anytime you like.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. So yes, it just remains really to thank both our panelists for your time and inspiration, and thanks to everyone else who's contributed. We still have the rest of the day to go with the festival, but I think that's the end of Stephen and Iain's substantial contributions to it. So thanks very much to both of you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Robert.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Steve.